The mansion sat on a sprawling lot in Alpharetta, just outside Atlanta. Once a vibrant home where Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston hosted parties and sang into the night, it had become a shadow of its former self. Neighbors whispered about the eerie quiet that now enveloped the property, a silence broken only by strange, unexplainable sounds. It was after Whitney's death in 2012 that the stories began. Former staff members claimed they would hear her unmistakable voice drifting through the halls late at night, humming a sorrowful melody. Some dismissed it as grief-fueled imagination. Others weren't so sure. By 2014, the house was empty, abandoned by Bobby and left to its ghosts. Still, it became a local legend, a place teenagers dared each other to approach on moonless nights. But for James Connors, a freelance journalist researching forgotten celebrity estates, it was more than a curiosity. It was a story he had to uncover. James arrived at the estate on a crisp October evening. The air felt heavy as he approached the iron gates. Though the grounds were overgrown, the house still loomed, its windows like dark eyes watching his every move. A strange energy prickled at his skin as he stepped inside. The grand entryway was cold despite the humid Georgia air. Dust coated the marble floors, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. As James set up his camera equipment, he thought he heard faint sobbing echoing from upstairs. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking against the silence. No answer. Determined to press on, James began exploring. In the living room, he found a cracked photograph of Bobby and Whitney, smiling on what looked like a summer day. It felt oddly out of place, as if someone had recently touched it. Then he noticed the piano. It was Whitney's pride and joy, the same piano she had played for family and friends. Dust veiled its surface, but when James touched one of the keys, it resonated with a hollow, mournful sound. He shivered, wondering if it was the same melody staff claimed to hear. As he turned to leave the room, the piano played a single, chilling note. James froze. "Is someone here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Again silence, but it was different now, charged, expectant. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was just his nerves. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, the air grew thick, almost suffocating. His flashlight flickered, and that's when he heard it. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, singing a few mournful bars of "I Will Always Love You." Heart pounding, James followed the sound up the sweeping staircase. The melody seemed to pull him toward the master bedroom. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a room frozen in time. Whitney's perfume still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. And then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a figure seated on the edge of the bed, her head bowed. But as he blinked, the figure became clearer. A woman in a white gown, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying. "Whitney," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure turned, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes were hollow, her face twisted in anguish. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a guttural wail erupted, so loud and piercing that James dropped his flashlight. He stumbled backward, crashing into the hallway wall. The room went dark, but the wailing continued, echoing through the house. Desperate to escape, James ran, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for air beneath the cold night sky. When James looked back at the house, the windows were lit, and a faint silhouette stood in the master bedroom, watching him. He never published the story. Locals say the house still stands, unsold and untouched, its legacy cemented as a monument to sorrow. Those brave enough to approach claim to hear Whitney's voice, singing through the night, a reminder that not all spirits find peace, even in death. James couldn't sleep that night. Back at his motel, he replayed the encounter in his mind, convincing himself it was exhaustion, stress, or the power of suggestion. Yet, as he sat in bed, staring at his laptop, the urge to go back gnawed at him. There was something unfinished about the house, as though it had more to reveal. Against his better judgment, he opened his camera files, hoping to make sense of what had happened. The photos and video clips from earlier that evening seemed ordinary at first, shots of the decaying piano, the cracked photograph, and the dust-covered staircase. But as he scrolled through the footage, he froze. In one of the stills of the living room, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A faint outline near the piano, like a translucent figure leaning over the keys. A chill crept down his spine as he zoomed in. The shape was blurred, but unmistakable. It was a woman. His heart raced as he opened the video file. The shaky footage showed him ascending the stairs, his flashlight beam illuminating the darkened hallways. At first, everything appeared as he remembered, but then, as he reached the top step, something moved in the corner of the screen. It was quick, so quick he nearly missed it. A shadow darted across the hallway, vanishing into the master bedroom. James paused the video, rewound, and played it again. This time he caught a detail that made his stomach drop. The shadow wasn't just a blur. It had a shape. A tall figure with broad shoulders, unmistakably male. Bobby? James shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. But the more he replayed the video, the more certain he became. He had heard rumors that Bobby had refused to return to the house after Whitney's death, saying it felt wrong, but he had never elaborated. Was this what he meant? The next morning, James decided to visit the only person who might give him answers. Marcus, the estate's former caretaker. Marcus had worked for the couple during their tumultuous years in Atlanta and was said to have been close to both. Marcus lived in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of town, and when James knocked on the door, the older man answered with a wary expression. "You hear about the house?" Marcus asked, his voice gruff. James nodded. "I was there last night. He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. "I think I saw something." Marcus stepped aside, motioning for James to enter. "You're not the first," he muttered. Over coffee, Marcus shared stories James had never heard before. He spoke of arguments that echoed through the halls, items moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of heaviness that grew worse after Whitney's death. "But it wasn't just her," Marcus said, his voice lowering. "Whatever's in that house, it's tied to both of them, like they're trapped there together, reliving the worst moments of their lives." James leaned forward, hanging on Marcus's every word. "Do you think they're haunting the house?" Marcus shook his head. "Haunting? No. It's more like the house itself remembers. All that pain, all that energy it soaked into the walls." James thought back to the figure in his video. "What about the shadow? The man?" Marcus's face darkened. "If you saw him, you're lucky you got out." "What do you mean?" James pressed. But Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he stood abruptly and walked to a small drawer, pulling out a weathered envelope. He handed it to James. Inside was a photograph of Bobby and Whitney in the living room of the estate, arms wrapped around each other. They looked happy, but something about the photo was off. James squinted, noticing a faint smudge behind them, a dark blur hovering near the piano. "That photo was taken a year before everything went downhill," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever that thing is, it was already there." James stared at the photo, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. For the first time, he wondered if what haunted the house wasn't Whitney or Bobby but something older, something darker. That night, James made a decision. He would return to the house, not for the story, but for answers. Something about the place was calling to him, pulling him back despite the danger. But as he packed his equipment, he didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible hum that filled the room. A familiar melody, as if sung by a voice just out of reach. And when he glanced at the photograph one last time, he swore the dark blur behind Bobby and Whitney was closer now, almost as if it were watching him. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. James's heart raced as he stared at the photograph in his hands. The shadow behind Bobby and Whitney now seemed to have form and almost human-like shape, its features obscured but undeniably present. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something, and that something was now drawing him back to the estate. By the time he reached the mansion the next evening, the air had grown unnaturally still. The house loomed before him like a dark sentinel, its windows' dark eyes watching his every movement. This time he wasn't alone. Marcus had insisted on accompanying him, a reluctant but firm presence at his side. "Don't go in without me," Marcus had said. his voice thick with dread. "There's something in there you don't understand." They stood at the front gate, which seemed to have shifted slightly on its hinges since James's last visit. The house felt different, darker, more oppressive. The very ground beneath their feet felt charged, like the air before a storm. As they entered the foyer, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just a chill from the neglected house, it was an unnatural cold, as though the walls themselves exhaled a breath that had been trapped for too long. Marcus's breath fogged in the air. "This is where it starts," he muttered, glancing warily around the room. James could barely hear him over the rush of his own pulse in his ears. He had the sense that something was watching, listening to every movement, every breath they took. They proceeded deeper into the house, the creak of their steps loud in the silence. They moved past the living room, where James had caught the strange figure the night before, and towards the staircase. But something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Not a sound. No rustle, no hum. Not even the creak of the old floorboards beneath their feet. Then they heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible voice, echoing from above. It was a woman's voice, familiar yet distorted. "I will always love you." Whitney's voice, unmistakable even in its ghostly distortion, floated down the stairs. Marcus froze, his face pale as death. "We need to leave. Now." His voice cracked. "That's not her." James tried to speak, to ask what Marcus meant. But before he could, the house shifted. The air grew heavier, the pressure inside the walls rising as if the mansion itself had inhaled deeply. The voice continued, rising in pitch, now a frantic whisper that seemed to reach into their souls. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the faintest whisper of a shadow passed across the wall behind them. It was quick, barely perceptible, but James felt the weight of it. Marcus grabbed his arm, nearly dragging him toward the staircase. "We don't have much time." But before they could make it, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, like something with a terrible burden was moving slowly toward them. James felt his stomach tighten, his body frozen in place. Something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and then the piano played again. It wasn't a note. It wasn't a song. It was a chaotic, violent bang, like the piano itself was fighting for its life. The sound rattled through the floorboards, and James was certain it was going to crack the house in two. Then, everything stopped. A suffocating silence. The air was thick with tension. Neither James nor Marcus moved, barely breathing as they stood in the entryway. The footsteps stopped. The piano went still. But now, the walls seemed to hum an unsettling, low vibration that shook James's bones. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it was angry. Out of the corner of his eye, James saw it. A figure, not Whitney, not Bobby. It was taller, broader. The shadow moved slowly, deliberately, across the hallway. James's pulse quickened. It was the same dark silhouette he had seen in the video. Without thinking, James stepped forward, despite Marcus's warning shout. "Don't!" But it was too late. As he crossed the threshold of the hallway, the figure turned to face him. For a split second, everything was still. The world seemed to pause as the shadow loomed before him. The features were indistinct, but one thing was clear: the shadow's eyes were glowing. A faint, sickly yellow light poured from them, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't move. Then, the air was suddenly filled with a low growl, a sound that should not have come from a human throat. It rumbled through his chest, vibrating the air, and the glow from the shadow's eyes intensified. Marcus yanked James back, pulling him away from the figure. "Get out!" Marcus shouted, his voice raw with terror. "It's him. It's Bobby." James tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Bobby? But it was the figure of someone else. Someone that neither of them recognized. Someone older. And as they stumbled back towards the door, the faintest whisper reached their ears, so soft, it was almost lost in the wind. "She's waiting for you." James spun around, but the hallway was empty. The shadow was gone. The house was silent again. But now it felt wrong. Like the walls were closing in, like the house had been listening, waiting for something, someone. They made it outside, gasping for air, both shaken to the core. But as they looked back at the house, the upstairs window flickered, and the faintest silhouette Bobby's figure stood in the dark, watching. And then, the piano began to play again. James and Marcus didn't speak as they stumbled away from the house, their feet carrying them faster than they ever thought possible. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and the weight of what they had just experienced pressed down on them with the suffocating force of 1,000 nightmares. Neither of them dared to look back. As they reached the gate, Marcus stopped abruptly and turned toward the house, his face pale, eyes wide with something like recognition and fear. "It's not over," he whispered, more to himself than to James. "It's never over." James didn't want to know what he meant, but the look in Marcus's eyes told him that leaving wasn't enough. Something was still inside that house, something tied to Bobby and Whitney, something that refused to let go. Just as they were about to turn and walk away, there was a sudden ear-splitting crash from inside the house. It was followed by a guttural scream, deep, anguished, like the earth itself was splitting in two. James turned back, his instincts telling him to run, but his feet felt rooted in place. He saw a flicker of movement through one of the shattered windows, something dark, something large, moving across the hall like a shadow come to life. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure was back, but this time it wasn't just watching. It was coming toward them. "No," Marcus muttered, shaking his head. "That's not him. It's not Bobby. It's something else. Something we can't even begin to understand." And then they heard it. The piano. The sound was no longer chaotic. It was melodic, a slow, haunting lullaby that seemed to reach out and pull at their very souls. It wasn't Whitney's voice anymore, but something darker, deeper, as though the house itself was calling to them, pleading for them to return. Marcus stepped backward, his hands trembling. "Get in the car. Now!" But it was too late. The ground beneath them began to shake as if the house were trembling in its death throes. The faintest rumble reverberated through the earth, and the front doors of the mansion, those massive wooden doors that had once been proud and regal, swung open with a force that sent a wave of wind rushing toward them. And in that moment, James realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Alive with grief, with anger, with the pain of two lives that had been shattered, two souls that refused to move on. And it had been waiting for someone, anyone, to step inside, to witness the torment that it had absorbed over the years. Marcus grabbed James by the arm, pulling him away from the gate. "Don't go back in. You don't understand. They're still here, both of them, trapped." Before James could respond, the door slammed shut. The rumbling stopped. The house, now dark and still, seemed to settle into an eerie calm. Then, a soft, trembling voice rose from within the mansion, a voice that sounded unmistakably like Whitney, but it was broken, filled with pain. "Help me! Help me!" The words echoed in the night, and James felt his stomach churn. Something was wrong with the house, something wrong with the voices, and he realized they weren't just whispers. They were pleas for escape, for release, for freedom from the grief that had bound them to the walls of that mansion. Marcus turned his face away. "No one can help them. No one. The house has taken them." With those words, they finally turned away from the estate, the sounds of the haunting lullaby still lingering in the air behind them. They didn't look back. But even as they drove off into the distance, the faintest shimmer of light caught James's eye in the rearview mirror, a silhouette standing at the window, watching them leave. And when they reached the edge of town, a soft, eerie tune floated on the wind, barely audible, but unmistakable. "I will always love you." It was Whitney's voice, but now, it carried a sense of finality, as if the house itself had relented, allowing the echoes of the past to fade away. But James knew better. The house would never truly release its grip. And as the last of the music faded into the night, he couldn't help but wonder how many more souls it would trap before its hunger was finally sated. And if they had left, or if they had only just entered. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.